Buju, Wago Shindigu, Migizi and Dode, Gazagasqua Jimekag, and Dunjiba. I'd like to share a little bit today about communalism as a function and guiding force in Indigenous life. If you go back maybe 10,000 years ago in human history, almost all humans were living in some sort of communal fashion. In Japan, in Europe, most of us had earth-based worldviews and a social and political fabric for life that revolved around a smaller group of people in a shared village. And all of us were indigenous to somewhere. Things started to change for a lot of different reasons. The agricultural age gave birth to, far more efficient food production. Human populations grew, cities were created, people left their communal home and came to areas to live a life where they didn't have shared community with other people. And this happened in many places at the same time. So it happened in what is today Tokyo in Japan. It happened in European cities. And to some degree, it happened in Native American cities too, such as the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, which, by the way, at the time of contact with Europeans was 3 times larger than the largest city in all of Europe at the time. That city was London. Urbanization and people being separated from their original communal home changed things. It changed worldviews and structures for society. And so in Europe and the Middle East, you had an especially rapid growth of cities and especially rapid changes to the structure of societies. There were a lot of other things that fueled and fed this, the birth of major world religions, different kinds of conflict. You could look at books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel to look at how these things functioned. And as it progressed, some people might argue with me about, what are the central tenets of like white European life? And I would say that these, which by the way transferred to America, would include things like individualism. Individual efforts, individual pursuits, I'm going to take care of me and mine, as opposed to my primary value is my ability to contribute to larger society or to take care of others. That doesn't mean people were simply selfish. Or certainly it doesn't mean that they didn't love or take care of their families. I think people did. But the worldview shifted from taking care of the communal group to taking care of me in my most immediate group. An increasing focus on things like the nuclear family as opposed to the whole big, broad, extended family. And I think some of the other defining attributes of the social fabric as people shifted out of communalism include competition, competing with one another, and materialism, the accumulation of wealth and assets and having more than thy neighbor. Even though the self-stated values, even in major world religions, speak to brotherly love and things like that, for pretty much every major religion in the world, the way people actually acted in structured societies was often at odds with those things. However, as this stuff shifted, and by the way, I would say that is still the case today. So for most, mainstream, like white Americans today, individualism, competition, and materialism structure a lot of life. And for those of us who are not like mainstream white Americans, to get by in this sort of society, we have to do those things too. If you look around my office, you'll see the evidence on the walls of my individualism. Look at my individual accomplishments. Look at my nice clothes, or, my good car, and they're evidence of my materialism. And anyone who knows me will know that I love a good challenge and competition. If you really think about it, like, how many board games or sports do you know where nobody wins and nobody loses? There are some. There's a game that I play with my kids with these like sinking islands, and either you all get out of there or none of you do. But they're rare, and you really got to look for them. In any event, although that's been the trajectory and, to me, defining features of the mainstream development, aside from groups like maybe the Aztec or Inca that had larger cities and scaled up hierarchy and stuff like that, I think most of indigenous space was still dominated by the culture of communalism, where the primary value of a person was not their ability to have more than others, but their ability to provide, share, and take care of others, not just themselves or their small circle. And often people harvested food together as a group. The entire village, for example, in Ojibwe country, would go harvest wild rice, and then they would put all their food together. It wasn't like the family that got more in their canoe would keep a little bit more or something like that. And then whoever needed food would take food out from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And in smaller villages and so forth, that worked great. But that was the social fabric. And both ways of structuring a society or culture, I'm not making value judgments, but they certainly were different. And communalism came with some special blessings. It really did. Like if there was a death in the family, let's say some guy, fell off a cliff and died, and he was one of the most important hunters for that nuclear group. Well, his brothers and other people would help provide for the rest of the family, and they would share the load and take care of each other. And if someone was grieving, they weren't alone to go deal with their grief. They were allowed and actually had no way to avoid sharing that with everyone else, and it would lighten some of the burdens and provide a mechanism for healing and coping with everything that life would bring, good and bad. And so profound changes happened. For example, with Native Americans, once we got to the reservation period, coming out of the Indian Wars and the efforts to relocate natives to reservations, communalism was still functional. People would still harvest wild rice and share their harvest. Even today, people still harvest wild rice or fish and then go around all the grandpas and grandmas and aunts and uncles and share their harvest. That still happens. But it started to come under a lot of pressure. And Native people really had a tough period in history where the children were being taken away and sent to residential boarding schools, beaten for speaking the languages that they knew, and punished or chastised when they would act in ways that were aligned with their indigenous values. If they, shared food or, tried to look out for one another, they would be isolated or punished. And so individualism was kind of beat in to people. And even today, to succeed, like if you're going to school, you will be rewarded if you work hard, study hard, and perform well on a test. And you will not be rewarded if you share the answers with the kid sitting next to you or try to solve problems together. There's some evolution in the way we teach now, where there's some cooperative learning, modalities and so forth that are being used, and some with great success. But it's just emerging and just starting to shift and change. So today, for Indigenous people, one of the things that happens, and one of the things I feel in my life, is that I code switch, right? So like if I'm going to go, do something at Bemidji State University where I'm working, I can code switch and operate very well with my academic English and my individual accomplishments and my competitive nature and all those things. I can bring that out. And the better I get at that, the better I do in mainstream America. But the further I move away from my Indigenous, communal, collaborative, and consensus-based ways of doing things. And I try to balance this. Like, I still make sure I get all my kids out in the woods to hunt and harvest, and I teach and coach about how to share resources and take care of others. I volunteer many, many hours of my time officiating at ceremonies and things like that. But there's still this tension. When does the code switching become assimilation? And famous Black thinkers and writers like Du Bois and James Baldwin have written about this topic called dual consciousness, where we spend so much time thinking in someone else's way that our own thinking starts to evolve and move that way. And we can shift back, but the dual consciousness is a special burden. White Americans don't have to deal with that, certainly not quite the same way. But today now, for Native people who have survived the 500 plus years of colonization and so forth, and are trying to figure out, where do we go from here and how do I go from here? Finding our way back to the cultural toolbox and communal ways of thinking and operating is really difficult. One of the things that happens is a lot of the places where that would naturally happen have been under assault. We generally don't simply live in a village and share our resources with whoever's our next door neighbors are. Many of us do live in ancient Indigenous villages, but we have electricity and running water and Netflix, and we're often spending time with whoever lives in that house with us more than, with our neighbors. And people aren't always growing up with their first cousins the way that we used to, even just a couple generations ago. So it's shifting and changing. And the ceremonial spaces where communalism might be reinforced, they exist. But for example, drum ceremonies, probably took place in almost every single Ojibwe village at one point in time. And now there may be 15 active ceremonial drums in Minnesota and just as many in Wisconsin, but that has to serve the entire Indigenous population of 2 whole states. And as a result, people have to drive to those places to connect to that kind of ceremony. And the same with many of our other ceremonies. We have to export ourselves rather than walk out the door and the wigwam's right there. Some people have that privilege, but most do not. Also, the majority of the tribal population lives off reservation in cities, or smaller towns and cities that are near reservations and sometimes far away. And so it becomes a financial and time burden to maintain those kind of communal connections. And as a result, when someone experiences a death, a loss, a grief, a stress, or a life challenge, it's very difficult to share the load with other people in the community because we are by physical space separated from other people in that community. And some cultural practices especially for some communities, have been so thoroughly eroded that it's impossible or extremely difficult to find a place you can go to get holy and reconnected and grounded in community. So people make adaptations, and those include creating community on our own, which is not necessarily a bad idea, except that it often leaves people on their own to develop the rules for the new community. So this is something that, for example, I would say the Black Americans have had to experiment with because their culture was so thoroughly assaulted through slavery and the colonial process that they endured. And so as a result, they had to latch on to things like the Southern Baptist Church and form Black community out of a formerly white institution. And that was what Martin Luther King did. Other people said, it's still coming from the oppressors. So Malcolm X was like, forget that stuff. Let's do something our people did. And others, Joy DeGruy and others today, advocate for Black people to return to their African Indigenous roots and explore healing and connection there. But still, it's an ocean and a continent away. And the details of exactly what village somebody came from are almost impossible to reconstruct. So as a result, people have to rebuild, remake, and reimagine things. For Indigenous people, we often have a few more tools to help us in the connection. In fact, one of the defining features of being Indigenous is connection to place, which helps connect to ancestral lines and community, even though those communities have also been under a thorough assault. A third of our people have been adopted and fostered out, and what remains of our tribal cultures and languages and so forth are still under a lot of pressure, even with something like the modern school system, which usually doesn't value, much less center, our ways. So Native people end up inventing and creating community too. In fact, in some ways, the powwow, which is, an accumulation of cultural dance and musical traditions from many different tribes. No one tribe had a powwow the way it is today, back in the day. It's an effort to recreate Indigenous community. And it really provides a lot of meaning for a lot of people, but it's no replication for ancient ceremonial and cultural traditions. That doesn't mean it's not valued. I powwow myself, I love it. But it's still not only is it not the same, but it doesn't provide the same measure of communalism as we seek to recreate community in that space. So this is one of the reasons that I highly value our more ancient traditions and encourage people who are able to reach out to transport themselves to, connect to, and deeply engage in things that foster genuine community. For Ojibwe people, that means, our drum ceremonies and other kinds of ceremonies that are really deeply formative for connecting people to place, ceremony, language, culture, tradition. And that doesn't mean that we don't have permission to change over time. Of course we do. And we wouldn't want to try to keep a culture frozen in time. It's so hard for those who've tried, like the Amish. They lose people every year, and there's so many stresses. I think it's fine that we adapt and evolve. But at the same time, I think it's problematic if we surrender the communal dimensions of our healing toolbox and social fabric. Those things are really vital, and they're worth fighting for. And the fight is not a fight against a person. It's a fight against ourselves to make the time, to sustain the time, to deepen the connections, and to walk that talk. Communalism, it's one of the fundamental fabrics to what it means to be Indigenous. And a lot of the things that can ground us to community and to one another are still there. And so I really encourage you to reach out, look out, explore, talk to people, and heighten and deepen your connection to your own communal roots as Indigenous people. Miigwech! Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, free Ojibwe language resources, resources for teachers, and more. Miigwech!